Hello my dear wanderers. Welcome back to our corner of quietude, where the ordinary world fades into whispers and the ancient stories of Ireland and the Celtic lands come alive in the flickering shadows. I'm so glad you've joined me tonight, for we're about to embark on a journey into one of the darkest corners of Celtic folklore, a place where even the bravest souls once feared to tread after nightfall. Tonight, we delve into the legend of the Sluagh, those restless spirits of the unforgiven dead who soar through the night skies in their endless, tormented hunt. This is not a tale of gentle fairy folk or mischievous sprites. This is something altogether more chilling, more primal, something that touched the very heart of ancient Celtic communities with a fear so profound that its echoes can still be felt in the traditions and superstitions that persist to this very day. So find yourself a comfortable place, somewhere safe and warm. Perhaps brew yourself a cup of tea, pull a blanket close, and settle in as the world outside grows darker. Let the glow of your screen be like the hearth fires of old, keeping the night at bay. For we're about to speak of things that our ancestors would only whisper about in hushed tones, glancing nervously toward their western windows as the sun began to set. The story of the Sluagh is woven through centuries of Irish and Scottish folklore, a thread of darkness running through the rich fabric of Celtic mythology. These beings exist at the intersection of life and death, neither fully one nor the other, trapped in an eternal twilight of their own making. They are the host of the Unforgiven Dead, and their tale is one that will send shivers down your spine while simultaneously revealing profound truths about how our ancestors understood death, redemption, and the thin veil that separates our world from the realms beyond. Take a deep breath, let yourself relax, and prepare to journey with me into the misty Highlands of Scotland, the windswept coasts of Ireland, and the lonely islands where the boundary between this world and the next grows whisper thin. The Sluagh await, and their story is one you won't soon forget. The name that must be spoken carefully. Before we can truly understand the Sluagh, we must first understand their name, for in Celtic tradition, names hold power beyond mere identification. They carry within them the essence of what they describe, and the name Sluagh is no exception to this ancient principle. The word itself comes from the Scottish Gaelic, pronounced roughly as Sluagh, though the exact pronunciation varies across regions and through the passage of time. It's a word that even today is spoken with a certain reverence, a certain caution, for there are those who still believe that to speak the name of the Sluagh too loudly or too often is to risk drawing their attention, and their attention is something no mortal would willingly seek. In its most literal translation, Sluagh means host, army, or crowd. But this is no ordinary gathering. This is not the festive host of a celebration or the disciplined army of a mortal king. This is the host of the dead, the Sluagh na Mab, a vast congregation of restless spirits bound together in their eternal exile from peace. The linguistic roots of the word reach deep into the Celtic past, stemming from Old Irish Sluagh, which could be spelled as either Sluagh or Sluagh, both carrying those same meanings of host, army, crowd, or assembly. This wasn't merely a word for any group, mind you, but specifically for a group bound together in common purpose, often with martial or supernatural connotations. When ancient Irish scribes wrote of armies, whether mortal or otherworldly, this was the word they reached for. Scholars of Celtic languages have traced the word even further back, to the Proto-Celtic root Sluagh. Based on comparative linguistics and related words in other Indo-European languages, this ancient root appears to have carried meanings connected to service or following a leader, giving us a haunting glimpse into how the concept might have originated. We can see echoes of this root in other Celtic languages. The Middle Welsh word lu means troop, while Old Breton used a similar form, lu, meaning army. Even beyond the Celtic world, there are intriguing connections. Lithuanian has the word Sluagh, meaning service or servitude, and Old Church Slavonic has Sluagh, meaning servant. These linguistic cousins suggest ancient connections between Celtic-speaking peoples and other European cultures, ties formed in the mists of prehistory. But the Sluagh are no ordinary servants. If indeed they once served some ancient chief or deity, that service has been twisted into something dark and terrible. They are bound not to any living master but to their own restless nature, compelled to hunt through the night skies by forces beyond mortal understanding. In some regions, the name takes on variations. You might hear them called the Sluagh side, explicitly linking them to the fairy folk, the side who dwell in the hollow hills and sacred mounds of Ireland. In other places, they are known simply as the fairy host, though this name does little justice to the terror they inspire. Unlike the often capricious but sometimes benevolent fairies of Irish legend, the Sluagh are almost universally described as malevolent, their intentions toward humanity rarely anything but harmful. The Scottish Highlands and Islands have their own particular relationship with the name. There, it became part of the very fabric of daily speech, woven into exclamations and warnings. The Gaelic exclamation, "O Sluagh," was used as a call for help from the fairy folk, though whether one would actually want the Sluagh to answer such a call is quite another matter. It's rather like crying out for aid and not being particular about what might come to your assistance, a practice our ancestors generally tried to avoid. What makes the name particularly fascinating is how it evolved through the Christian era. As Christianity spread through Ireland and Scotland, bringing with it new concepts of heaven, hell, and the afterlife, the understanding of the Sluagh shifted and transformed. They became explicitly linked with the idea of the Unforgiven Dead, those souls who could find rest in neither heaven nor hell, nor even in the traditional pagan otherworld. Their name thus took on additional layers of meaning, encompassing not just a host or army, but specifically a host of the damned, the rejected, the eternally restless. In written records, we find variations in spelling as different scribes and scholars tried to capture the sounds of spoken Gaelic in written form. You'll see Sluagh, slow, Sluagh, and other variations, each reflecting slightly different regional pronunciations or individual choices by the writers. This variety in spelling actually tells us something important: that the Sluagh were not just a literary invention, but a living part of oral tradition, spoken of in different dialects and communities throughout the Celtic world. There's an old warning that's been passed down through the generations in parts of Scotland and Ireland: never say the name of the Sluagh 9 times in succession. To do so, according to this tradition, is to call them to you, to mark yourself as someone aware of their existence and therefore someone they might notice. While we cannot determine how ancient this particular taboo is, it speaks to the power attributed to the name itself. Words, in Celtic tradition, were never merely sounds. They were understood as having the capacity to shape reality, of bridging the gap between the seen and unseen worlds. The name also appears in compound forms and phrases throughout Gaelic literature and folklore. We find it in descriptions of otherworldly battles, in accounts of supernatural occurrences, and in warnings passed from generation to generation. Each appearance adds another layer to our understanding of what the Sluagh represented to those who believed in them, and believed they did, with a conviction that shaped their very way of life. The forms they take, shadows against the sky. If you were to stand on the windswept coast of Western Ireland or the lonely moors of the Scottish Highlands on a moonless night, and if you were unfortunate enough to catch sight of the Sluagh, what would you see? The descriptions that have come down to us through centuries of folklore paint a picture both vivid and terrifying, though the exact details shift and change like the forms of the Sluagh themselves. Most commonly, witnesses describe the Sluagh as appearing like a vast flock of birds against the night sky. Not just any birds, mind you, but birds of the darkest omen. Ravens, crows, jackdaws, those creatures that feed on carrion and gather at places of death. Some accounts speak of them as being similar to starlings, those birds that move in great murmurations, swirling and swooping in patterns that seem to have a mind of their own. Picture, if you will, a massive cloud of these dark birds, hundreds or perhaps thousands strong, moving across the sky in a formation that's almost crescent-shaped, like a dark moon cutting through the night. But these were no ordinary birds. Look more closely, the old stories say, and you would see that something is profoundly wrong with these creatures. Their shapes seem to shift and blur at the edges, as if they cannot quite maintain a solid form. They appear to be wrapped in shadows that undulate and flow like water, or like smoke caught in an invisible wind. The beating of their wings doesn't sound quite right. It's too loud, too rhythmic, like the beating of a vast drum or the pounding of countless feet in a forced march. In the Western Isles of Scotland, particularly on islands like Barra and Benbecula, the local population developed very specific descriptions of the Sluagh's appearance. They spoke of seeing what looked like grey birds at first, but as the phenomenon drew closer, the terrible truth would become apparent. These were not birds at all, or at least not entirely. They were spirits, the souls of the dead, taking on forms that might allow them to travel through the air but could never quite disguise their true, dreadful nature. Some descriptions become more detailed and far more disturbing. Witnesses who claimed to have seen the Sluagh up close, or to have survived encounters with them, described creatures that were skeletal and emaciated, as if all the flesh had been stripped away, leaving only skin stretched tight over bone. Their fingers, if they could be called fingers, were long and gnarled like the bare branches of winter trees, ending in talons sharp as blackthorn. Some accounts mention webbed palms, as if these creatures were adapted for their endless flight through the night air. Their legs, when visible, were described as malformed, bent at unnatural angles, perhaps explaining why they seemed to prefer flight to walking upon the earth. The faces of the Sluagh, in those accounts detailed enough to mention such things, were perhaps the most horrifying aspect of all. They were described as having mouths like beaks, sharp and cruel, capable of tearing at flesh or souls with equal ease. Their hair, what remained of it, hung in thin, dark strands, lank and lifeless. The eyes, when mentioned at all, were spoken of as being empty, or perhaps filled with a hunger that could never be satisfied, a desperate longing that had consumed everything else that might have once made them human. But the Sluagh did not always appear in such corporeal forms. Many accounts speak of them as being primarily shadow and darkness, visible not so much as distinct entities but as a roiling mass of blackness against the night sky, a darkness somehow deeper than the ordinary dark of night. They might appear as a churning storm cloud, except that this cloud moved with purpose and terrible intelligence. Or they might manifest as a sudden, inexplicable wind, a gust that seemed to carry with it the whisper of countless voices, all speaking at once in languages both familiar and alien. On the Isle of Barra, local tradition held that the Sluagh fought great battles in the sky itself, host against host, engaged in some eternal conflict that mortal minds could not comprehend. Witnesses claimed to see what looked like vast aerial armies clashing in the darkness above them, and after such battles, they would find strange marks on rocks and stones. These crimson stains, which the locals called Fuel nan Sluagh, the blood of the hosts, were said to be proof of these spectral conflicts. Modern observers might note that these red colorations on rocks, particularly beautiful in the frost, have more prosaic geological explanations, but to the islanders who lived with the constant presence of the Sluagh in their folklore, these marks were tangible evidence of the reality of the spirits. The formation in which the Sluagh typically flew was also significant. That crescent shape, mentioned repeatedly in accounts from across the Celtic world, wasn't random. The crescent is a liminal shape, neither full nor empty, associated with transition and transformation. It's the shape of the moon when it's neither completely visible nor completely hidden, when it exists in a state between. This makes it particularly fitting that the Sluagh, who themselves exist in the twilight between life and death, should take this form when they fly, though whether this connection was conscious symbolism or simply how witnesses interpreted what they saw remains an open question. Some accounts mention that the Sluagh could approach from any direction except the east. The east, of course, is where the sun rises, where light and life come from. The Sluagh, being creatures of death and darkness, were said to be unable to come from that direction, as if the very orientation toward the dawn was anathema to their nature. They came most often from the west, the direction of the setting sun, the direction that in Celtic cosmology was associated with the Otherworld, with the land of the dead, with those mystical blessed isles where departed souls were said to dwell. There's an interesting dichotomy in the descriptions we have of the Sluagh. Sometimes they are described as being almost corporeal, physical enough to be seen clearly, to interact with the physical world, to carry away living humans or cattle. Other times, they are described as being entirely spectral, visible only as shadows or felt only as a sudden cold wind, a presence rather than a physical entity. This shifting nature might reflect different types of manifestations, different strengths of appearance depending on various factors like the time of year, the location, or the spiritual state of the witness. Or it might simply reflect the fundamental truth about the Sluagh, that they exist in a state between, never fully one thing or another, trapped in an eternal liminality. In more recent folklore collections from the 19th and early 20th centuries, we find accounts that blend the physical and the supernatural in fascinating ways. Walter Evans-Wentz, that pioneering collector of Celtic fairy lore, gathered numerous accounts during his travels through Ireland and Scotland between 1908 and 1910. The people he spoke with, many of them elderly even then, were often the last generation to have grown up with these beliefs as living tradition rather than historical curiosity. They spoke of the Sluagh as something real, something that had to be accounted for in daily life, something that shaped decisions about everything from house construction to the timing of journeys. The physical descriptions they provided varied, but certain themes emerged again and again. Darkness, flight, a disturbing mixture of human and animal characteristics, an aura of wrongness that made it clear these were not natural creatures. They were something that shouldn't exist, and yet did, a violation of the natural order that marked them as products of the supernatural realm. The nature of the damned. Who are the Sluagh? One of the most fascinating aspects of the Sluagh legend is the question of their fundamental nature. What exactly are these creatures? Where do they come from? What makes a soul join their ranks? The answers to these questions reveal much about Celtic beliefs regarding death, morality, and the afterlife, and how those beliefs changed and evolved over time. In the oldest traditions, before Christianity arrived in Ireland and Scotland, the evidence suggests the Sluagh were understood as a type of fairy folk, but fairy folk of the most dangerous and malevolent kind. They were not the trooping fairies who might dance at twilight or play tricks on unsuspecting travelers. They were not the household brownies who might help with chores in exchange for a bowl of cream. They were fairies gone wrong, twisted and corrupted, existing outside the normal order of the fairy world. Some traditions held that the Sluagh were fairies who had been cast out from the Otherworld, exiled from the hollow hills and sacred mounds where the proper fairy folk dwelt. What crime could cause such an exile? The old stories are vague on this point, but they hint at fundamental betrayals, unforgivable transgressions that made even the capricious fairy courts turn against them. This interpretation suggests they had become, in essence, fairy outcasts, and in their exile, they had grown twisted and malevolent, their long separation from the proper order of things transforming them into something truly monstrous. This interpretation connects the Sluagh to the Unseelie Court, that darker reflection of the Sluagh court that features prominently in Scottish fairy lore. The Unseelie, whose very name means unholy or unblessed, were the malicious fairies, the ones who took pleasure in causing harm to humans and who required no provocation to do so. While even the Sluagh court could be dangerous if offended, they at least operated according to certain rules and could sometimes be benevolent. The Unseelie knew no such restraints. They were creatures of chaos and cruelty, and the Sluagh were often described as being among the most terrible of the Unseelie host. But with the coming of Christianity to the Celtic lands, a new interpretation of the Sluagh emerged, one that would eventually become the dominant understanding. In this Christian framework, the Sluagh were not fairy folk at all, but rather the souls of dead humans, specifically those who had died unrepentant of their sins or who had committed deeds so terrible that they could find rest in neither heaven nor hell. Think about the implications of this for a moment. These were souls rejected by every possible afterlife. Heaven's gates were closed to them because of their sins. Hell, surprisingly, would not take them either, perhaps because even the powers of darkness found something about them unsuitable, or because their particular combination of sins and circumstances made them unsuitable for any final destination. And the traditional Celtic Otherworld, that realm where the fairy folk dwelt and where worthy souls might find rest among the ancient gods, had also turned them away. This triple rejection created beings in a state of absolute spiritual homelessness. They belonged nowhere. They could rest nowhere. And so they were condemned to wander the earth eternally, neither alive nor properly dead, existing in a liminal state of perpetual torment. This torment, in turn, made them bitter, angry, and dangerous. Having been denied peace themselves, they sought to deny it to others, stealing away the souls of the dying or the living, forcing others to share in their endless, restless existence. Who exactly fell into this category? The folklore gives us several possibilities. Some traditions spoke of the Sluagh as being specifically those who had died with unfinished business, with grievances unresolved, with tasks left incomplete. These were souls who could not move on because something tied them to the mortal world, some obsession or anger or unresolved conflict that kept them bound to the earth even after death. Other accounts suggested that the Sluagh were sinners of particular types. Not just ordinary sinners, mind you, for all humans sin and most are presumed to find their way to some form of afterlife eventually. These were individuals who had committed the gravest of moral transgressions without any sign of repentance. Murderers, perhaps. Oath breakers, which in Celtic society was considered among the most serious of crimes. Those who had betrayed their kin or their lord, violating the sacred bonds that held society together. Those who had committed sacrilege, whether against Christian churches or the ancient sacred sites. A particularly poignant tradition held that the Sluagh included the souls of unbaptized children. This belief, which developed strongly during the Christian era, reflected medieval theological anxieties about the fate of infants who died before they could be christened. Church doctrine struggled with this question, eventually developing the concept of limbo as a place for such innocents. But folklore took a darker turn, suggesting that these unbaptized souls, through no fault of their own, were denied entry to heaven and thus became part of the Sluagh, forever seeking revenge for their unjust fate. This is perhaps one of the most tragic interpretations of the Sluagh's nature, transforming them from villains into victims, from the wicked dead into innocents punished by circumstance. Some folklorists have proposed that the Sluagh legend might have served, at least in part, as a personification of disease, particularly epidemic illnesses that swept through communities like an invisible, deadly wind. The Sluagh's ability to fly through the air, to strike without warning, to leave death in their wake, certainly mirrors the experience of plague or other infectious diseases in times before their mechanisms were understood. The west wind, from which the Sluagh were said to come, was often associated with storms and harsh weather that could bring sickness with them. While this theory cannot fully explain all aspects of the legend, it offers one lens through which to understand its development and persistence. But perhaps the most intriguing interpretation is one that acknowledges multiple origins at play. The Sluagh might have begun as ancient pre-Christian spirits or deities associated with death and the wild hunt, that terrifying supernatural phenomenon found throughout European folklore. As Celtic paganism gave way to Christianity, these ancient entities could have been reinterpreted through a Christian lens, becoming the damned souls of sinful humans. And over time, as the legend continued to evolve, it likely absorbed other fears and concerns, becoming a catch-all explanation for death, disease, misfortune, and the fundamental human anxiety about what lies beyond the grave. This layered development would explain why the legend contains seemingly contradictory elements and why different regions emphasized different aspects. What's particularly notable in the folklore is that the Sluagh did not discriminate in their hunting. While they were themselves composed of the wicked dead, they would take anyone they could catch, wicked or righteous, sinner or saint. Your moral character in life might determine whether you joined their ranks after death, but it would do little to protect you from becoming their prey while you still lived. This terrifying egalitarianism meant that no one was safe, that virtue alone could not protect you. You had to take active precautions, had to know the right protections, had to understand the rules by which these creatures operated. There's also a fascinating tradition that suggests the Sluagh could force living humans to serve them. Men and women abducted by the host were sometimes returned to the mortal world, but they came back changed, exhausted, often babbling about being made to participate in the Sluagh's hunts, to help them in their grim work of stealing souls and causing harm. Some accounts speak of these unfortunate individuals being made to shoot poison arrows at cattle or at other humans, acting as the hands through which the Sluagh could directly interact with the physical world. And always, these temporary servants of the Sluagh spoke of being treated cruelly, dragged through mud and mire, rolled in pools, tormented even as they were forced to do the host's bidding. This aspect of the legend might have served a social function, providing an explanation for unexplained absences, for strange behavior after such absences, or perhaps even for mental illness that manifested in violent or disturbing ways. If someone did something terrible and inexplicable, one possible explanation was that they had been taken by the Sluagh and forced to act against their will. It was both an explanation and, in some ways, an excuse, a way of understanding the inexplicable without having to confront the full horror of human capacity for cruelty. Whether this social function was the origin of these particular stories or simply a secondary use to which they were put, we cannot say with certainty. The question of the Sluagh's nature, then, doesn't have a simple answer. They are creatures of paradox, fairy and human spirit, victim and villain, manifestation of natural phenomena and supernatural entities in their own right. They exist in the spaces between categories, which is perhaps only fitting for beings who themselves exist between life and death, between this world and the next. The Unseelie Court and the Wild Hunt. To truly understand the Sluagh, we must place them within the broader context of Celtic fairy lore, particularly the concept of the Unseelie Court and its connection to one of the most widespread and terrifying phenomena in European folklore, the Wild Hunt. In Scottish tradition particularly, the fairy folk were divided into two great courts or factions, though this division seems to have been a relatively late development in the folklore, possibly emerging most clearly in the Scottish lowlands before spreading to other regions. These were the Sluagh Court and the Unseelie Court, terms that reveal much about how our ancestors understood the dual nature of the supernatural world. The Sluagh Court, whose name comes from a Scots word meaning blessed or holy, represented the more benevolent or at least neutral aspects of fairy kind. The Sluagh fairies could certainly be capricious, could play tricks on humans or demand offerings and respect, but they generally operated according to certain rules. If you treated them properly, if you showed them respect and avoided giving offense, you might even gain their favor. They were associated with light, with spring and summer, with growth and life. Their processions through the countryside, while certainly not something you'd want to interrupt, were described as beautiful, terrible in their magnificence but not necessarily malevolent. The Unseelie Court, by contrast, represented everything dark and terrible in the fairy world. The name itself, meaning unholy or unblessed, tells you everything you need to know about how they were perceived. These were the malicious fairies, the ones who needed no provocation to do harm, who took pleasure in causing suffering, who were most active during the dark half of the year, during autumn and winter when death stalked the land. While the Sluagh court might punish those who offended them, the Unseelie needed no such excuse. They were hostile to humanity by their very nature, creatures of chaos and cruelty who reveled in the pain and fear they caused. And the Sluagh were counted among the most terrible members of the Unseelie court, if not the most terrible of all. Even other malicious fairies were said to be wary of the Sluagh, to give them wide berth, to avoid drawing their attention. They were the elite shock troops of the Dark Court, the most dangerous and destructive of an already dangerous and destructive host. The connection between the Sluagh and the Wild Hunt is particularly significant. The Wild Hunt is a phenomenon that appears in folklore across much of Northern and Western Europe, from Germany to France, from Scandinavia to Britain and Ireland. The details vary from place to place, but the core concept remains remarkably consistent: a supernatural hunting party that rides or flies through the night sky, usually led by some god, demon, or legendary figure, bringing death and terror in its wake. In Germanic and Norse tradition, the Wild Hunt was often led by Odin himself, the All-Father, accompanied by the souls of warriors who had died in battle. In other regions, the leader might be some ancient king or hero, condemned to hunt forever as punishment for some transgression. In Wales, the Corn Andun, the Hounds of Andun, were associated with the Wild Hunt, spectral dogs with red ears whose appearance presaged death. In England, various names and leaders were given to the hunt, from Herne the Hunter to King Arthur himself. The Wild Hunt was associated with storms, with the harsh winds of autumn and winter, with times of chaos and change. To see the hunt was usually considered an omen of war, plague, or other catastrophes. To be caught in its path could lead to death, madness, or abduction, with the unfortunate victim either killed on the spot or swept up to ride with the hunt, only to be found later, if at all, exhausted or dead or driven insane by the experience. The Sluagh fit perfectly into this pattern. They were, in many ways, the Celtic manifestation of the Wild Hunt, or at least one manifestation of it, for the concept took various forms even within Celtic lands. Like the Wild Hunt of other cultures, the Sluagh were associated with storms and harsh weather, with the sound of wind and the beating of countless wings that might be mistaken for thunder. Like the Wild Hunt, they rode forth to claim souls and cause chaos. And like the Wild Hunt, they were most active during liminal times, particularly at Samhain, that festival that marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter, when the veil between the worlds grew thin and the dead walked among the living. But the Sluagh added their own particular Celtic flavor to the Wild Hunt concept. They were not led by any god or hero, at least not in most accounts. They were a collective, a host, bound together not by loyalty to a leader but by their shared exile from rest. They were democratic in their damnation, so to speak, with no hierarchy beyond the simple rule of the strongest or the most vicious. The aerial nature of the Sluagh's hunt was also particularly pronounced. While other versions of the Wild Hunt might ride on horseback or be accompanied by hounds running along the ground, the Sluagh were almost entirely aerial in their nature. They were creatures of the sky, of the wind, of the space above the earth where the living dwelt. This made them even more terrifying in some ways, for there was no hiding from them behind locked doors if they could descend from above. No barrier of water or iron on the ground could stop their approach if they came from the sky. The time of Samhain, that most significant of Celtic festivals, was when the Sluagh's connection to the Wild Hunt was most apparent. Samhain marked not just the end of the harvest but the opening of the year's dark half, the time when death held sway over life, when the Otherworld pressed close to the mortal realm. On Samhain night, the gates between worlds stood open, and all manner of spirits and supernatural beings could cross over. The Sluagh, forever trapped between worlds, were particularly active at this time, taking advantage of the thinned veil to hunt with even greater freedom than usual. It's worth noting that the connection between the Sluagh and the Unseelie Court was not always clear or consistent in the folklore. Some accounts seem to treat them as separate entities, with the Sluagh being their own distinct group, perhaps more ancient or more terrible than even the Unseelie fairies. Other accounts make them explicitly part of the Unseelie host, just the most fearsome contingent of it. And some traditions blur the lines entirely, using Sluagh and Unseelie almost interchangeably. This inconsistency is actually revealing. It suggests that the Sluagh legend has deep roots, perhaps predating the more organized concept of fairy courts. As Celtic society evolved and Christian ideas mixed with pagan traditions, attempts were made to categorize and organize the various supernatural beings that populated folklore. The Sluagh, being so prominent and so feared, had to be fit into this organizational scheme somehow. But their nature was perhaps too primal, too ancient, too tied to fundamental human fears about death and the afterlife, to fit neatly into any category. So they remained somewhat apart, recognized as connected to the darker fairy folk, but never fully domesticated into the broader system of fairy courts and hierarchies. The wild hunt, in all its forms, served important psychological and social functions. It provided an explanation for storms and natural disasters. It warned people to stay indoors during dangerous times. It reinforced social and moral codes by threatening those who broke them with supernatural punishment. And perhaps most importantly, it gave form and shape to the formless fear of death, making it into something that could be understood, avoided, perhaps even survived through the right precautions. The Sluagh, as the Celtic world's premier manifestation of this universal archetype, carried all these functions and more. They were storm and death and judgment all rolled into one terrifying package. They were the price of sin, the consequence of dying unrepentant, the embodiment of the fear that there might be something worse than death. And yet, paradoxically, they were also a comfort of sorts, because something you can name, something you can describe, something you know the rules about, is less frightening than the completely unknown. By giving terror a face and a name, even a face and name as frightening as the Sluagh, folklore made the unknown slightly more bearable. The hunt, how the Sluagh claimed their prey. The methods by which the Sluagh hunted and claimed their victims reveal much about the practical fears of Celtic communities, and how those fears were given supernatural expression. This was not random violence or mindless chaos. The Sluagh operated according to certain patterns, certain rules, and understanding these patterns was essential for anyone hoping to avoid becoming their prey. The Sluagh hunted primarily at night. This much was universally agreed upon. Daylight was anathema to them, or at least severely limited their power. With the setting of the sun, they emerged from whatever dark places they sheltered in during the day, those forgotten corners behind ragwort stalks and dock leaves mentioned in some accounts, or perhaps from some deeper recess of the otherworld. As the light faded and darkness spread across the land, the Sluagh took to the air, beginning their nightly hunt for souls. Their primary targets were the dying. This is mentioned again and again in accounts from across the Celtic world. When someone lay on their deathbed, when their soul was preparing to depart their body, that was when they were most vulnerable to the Sluagh. The host would gather, circling the house like vultures circling prey, waiting for that moment of transition when the soul would be forced to leave the body and begin its journey to whatever afterlife awaited it. The Sluagh sought to intercept that departing soul before it could receive the proper rites, before it could be commended to heaven or find its way to the other world. If they succeeded, that soul would be forced to join their ranks, becoming one more member of the host, compelled to spend eternity hunting as they had been hunted. This was why the western windows of a house would be kept tightly shut when someone was dying. The Sluagh were said to come from the west, and an open window facing that direction was an invitation for them to enter and steal away the departing soul. But the dying were not their only targets. The Sluagh were also said to hunt the living, particularly those who were vulnerable in certain ways. Those who traveled alone at night, especially in lonely or liminal places like crossroads, bridges, or the margins between settlements and wilderness, these were at particular risk. The Sluagh could descend upon such unfortunates, seizing them bodily and carrying them away through the air. What happened to those who were taken while still living varied in different accounts. Sometimes they were found the next day, returned to earth but profoundly changed. They might be exhausted, prostrate, unable to speak clearly or to remember where they had been taken. They might babble about having been forced to travel vast distances through the air, over lands and seas, shown strange and terrible sights. In some cases, the physical evidence of their journey was undeniable. They might be found miles from where they disappeared, in locations they could not possibly have reached by normal means in the time they were gone. Other accounts were darker still. Sometimes the victim was found dead, their body showing signs of having fallen from a great height, bones broken, life extinguished. In these cases, it was said that the Sluagh had used the person for their purposes, perhaps forcing them to participate in the hunt itself, and then discarded them like a broken tool when they were no longer needed. One particularly disturbing tradition held that the Sluagh could force living humans to become their weapons. Men were said to have been abducted and made to serve as archers for the host. The Sluagh would give them invisible arrows, projectiles made of shadow or malice or some substance that existed between the material and spiritual worlds. These unfortunate servants would then be compelled to shoot these arrows at cattle or at other humans, causing illness, injury, or death. The accounts speak of some of these forced archers trying to resist, trying to miss their targets deliberately because they retained enough of their humanity to be horrified by what they were being made to do. But the Sluagh were cruel masters, punishing any sign of disobedience or reluctance. The abducted humans would be beaten, dragged through mud and mire, rolled in stagnant pools, tormented in countless ways until they complied with the host's demands. There were also accounts of the Sluagh specifically targeting those with broken hearts, those suffering from profound sadness or depression. The folklore speaks of them being drawn to hopeless hearts, to souls so laden with grief or despair that they were already halfway between life and death. Such individuals, it was said, practically called out to the Sluagh even without intending to, their spiritual vulnerability making them easy prey. This adds a particularly poignant dimension to the legend, suggesting that emotional and mental suffering could make one just as vulnerable as physical dying. The Sluagh's hunting patterns were also linked to the seasons and to specific times of power in the Celtic calendar. While they could hunt any night, they were most active and most dangerous during certain periods. Samhain, that festival marking the transition from the light half to the dark half of the year, was the most dangerous time of all. On Samhain night, when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest, the Sluagh rode forth in their greatest numbers, their power at its peak. This was why, even more than on other nights, people would stay indoors, would ensure all western windows were shut tight, would take every precaution they knew. But Samhain was not the only dangerous time. The entire dark half of the year, from November through April, was considered the Sluagh's season. These were the months when death stalked the land most openly, when food grew scarce, when cold and darkness reigned. The Sluagh, being creatures of death and darkness themselves, were naturally more active during this time. In contrast, during the light half of the year, from May through October, their power waned somewhat, though they never disappeared entirely. The actual mechanics of how the Sluagh captured their prey varied somewhat in different accounts. Sometimes they were said to simply seize a person bodily, their skeletal fingers surprisingly strong, lifting the victim into the air and carrying them away. Other times, their method was more subtle, more insidious. They might use glamour, that fairy magic that could make things appear other than they were, to lure someone away from safety. They might create lights that would lead travelers astray, or sounds that would draw the curious into danger. There are accounts of the Sluagh using the voices of loved ones to trick people into opening doors or windows that should have remained shut. They might imitate the cry of a child in distress, the call of a spouse or parent, knowing that natural human compassion would drive someone to respond to such sounds. And when the door or window was opened, the Sluagh would rush in, claiming their prey. The phenomenon of the Sluagh kidnapping people and then returning them far from where they were taken is particularly interesting from a folkloric perspective. The story of the French princess who was supposedly abducted by the Sluagh and carried over vast distances before being dropped on a small island in the Outer Hebrides is one example. She was found grievously injured, dying from the rough treatment she had received during her aerial journey. But she lived long enough to tell her story to those who found her. The islanders built a cairn over her grave, a pile of stones meant to keep her body from being stolen away again by the host. Such stories served multiple purposes. They explained mysterious appearances of strangers in unlikely places. They provided cautionary tales about the dangers of being abroad at night or in lonely places. And they reinforced the reality of the Sluagh in the minds of the community, providing what seemed like physical evidence of supernatural activity. Their primary were also said to attack livestock. This is mentioned again when denied their right from across the Celtic world. If when someone lay around their house were strong enough when their soul was preparing to depart their body, they might turn their anger vulnerable animals instead. The host would gather sheep, circling the house like cats might suddenly sicken and die, waiting for that moment of transition when the soul would be forced to leave the body. These deaths begin its journey to whatever afterlife awaited it. Their fury. The Sluagh sought to intercept that departing soul of the legend before it could receive the proper rights. Sudden livestock to heaven or find its way to the family's economy and if they succeeded, that soul would be forced to join their ranks. Accident, becoming one more member of the host, all were possibilities, compelled to spend eternity attributing such losses to the Sluagh made the tragedy. This was why the western windows of a house would be kept tightly shut. It also reinforced the importance of the protective rituals. The Sluagh were said to come from the west that communities and an open window facing that direction. If you followed the old ways, an invitation for them the windows shut, steal away said the right prayers. Maintain but the dying were not their only targets. Perhaps you could avoid the Sluagh were also said to hunt the living. But if you grew careless, particularly those who were vulnerable, if you forgot the old knowledge, those who travelled alone at night, especially in lonely or liminal places like hunting practices, bridges, persistence, or the margins, they were not easily discouraged. If they marked someone as prey, they would return night after night, such unfortunates, seeking any opportunity, seizing them bodily, any moment carrying them away through the air. This is why what happened to those who were taken while still living varied in different accounts. Not just sometimes they were found the next day. Returned the Sluagh were patient in their way. Patient, they might be exhausted, those who have eternity to accomplish, unable to speak clearly, the western direction where they had been taken. Geography of dread. They might babble of all the specific details associated with the Sluagh legend. Overlaps, perhaps none is more consistent shown strange across different regions and time in some cases their connection the physical evidence of their journey this directional association is so strong, be found miles so from fundamental to the folklore in locations actually shape the physical architecture by normal means and the daily practices of families. Other accounts were darker still. Some to understand why the West held such significance, their body showing signs of must delve into Celtic cosmology and the deep symbolism embedded in the cardinal directions. In these cases, in Celtic tradition, it was said that the Sluagh was intimately associated with death and the perhaps forcing them to participate. This wasn't merely superstition itself, but rather then discarded them like a broken symbolic system they were no longer mapped needed. The spiritual world. One particularly disturbing tradition held the West the Sluagh could force living humans where light to become their weapons. It was the direction to have been abducted and made passages into darkness for the host of transition. The Sluagh would give them invisible arrows of mystery, projectiles the ancient shadow or malice or some substance that existed those mystical the material the dead spiritual world. Where the fairy folk had these unfortunate servants would lay somewhere to the west shoot these arrows out beyond the edge of the known humans. Irish mythology spoke of Tir na death. The accounts speak of some of these forced archers trying to resist and seas, trying to miss these were places of eternal life they retained enough of their humanity. They were also places horrified by what they were being realms that the living could only reach. The Sluagh were cruel masters, rare and dangerous, punishing any sign of disobedience or reluctance. This westward orientation of the other world meant that the west was the direction through mud and mire, supernatural rolled in stagnant most naturally come, tormented in countless ways. And if the Sluagh were indeed souls exiled from all the various afterlives, there were also accounts where else would they come specifically but the direction of those afterlives themselves. Those suffering they came from the west because the west was where the realms of the folklore speaks of them being drawn to hope, being forever connected to death, souls so laden with grief or despair that they were already halfway between life and death. The practical implications of this belief, it was said, and practically called out to when someone was dying or seriously ill in a house, their spiritual vulnerability-facing windows and doors would be firmly closed. This adds a particularly poignant dimension. This wasn't a casual precaution, suggesting that emotional and mental suffering could make one just as Sluagh were believed to fly in from the west. The Sluagh's hunting souls were also linked to particularly the souls of those who were on the power in the Celtic calendar. While they could hunt any window was essentially they were most active and most dangerous during certain periods. This practice persisted remarkably late in some festival marking the transition well into the 20th century. The dark half in remote parts of Ireland was the most dangerous time, particularly in the islands and Highlands, where traditional when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. People still followed this rode forth in their greatest when word spread that someone was dying. Peak. Neighbors would come to help with many even things, more than on other nights, and one of the first tasks was always ensuring all western windows were shut tight. Would take the architectural implications were but Samhain was not the only dangerous when building a house. The entire dark half was given to the place from November through April western windows was considered the some families deliberately built these were the months when death stalked the land facing west, when placed them high up where they could be more cold and darkness reigned. Bedslua, being creatures of death were often positioned to avoid the western side more active during this time, so that the vulnerable sleeping occupants during the light not be exposed to whatever might come from that direction. Their power waned somewhat, but the western direction held significance beyond the actual mechanics of how the Sluagh captured their very orientation of one's travel could be dangerous. Sometimes they were said to simply seize while traveling westward was considered skeletal fingers surprisingly strong, as you were effectively moving in the same direction carrying the Sluagh themselves. Other times, making yourself their method was more subtle, more insidious. Conversely, they might use glamour at night. That fairy magic still not advisable make things appear other considered somewhat safe to lure someone as you were moving toward the direction of they might create lights that away from travelers astray, or sounds that would draw the curious. The Sluagh were said to be unable to. There are accounts of the Sluagh using the voices of loved ones as the direction of sunrise, opening doors, of light's daily victory over darkness. Shut. They might imitate the cry of a child in distress. This created a kind of call of a spouse or parent, where safety knowing that natural human moved or oriented would drive someone to respond to such sounds, and danger increased. And when the door or window was open toward the west, the Sluagh would rush in. This eastern protection extended to the phenomenon of the Sluagh kidnapping people. Some traditions then returning that if you turned from where they were taken is particularly interesting from a folkloric might be spared from their notice. The story of the French orientation was supposedly abducted by the Sluagh, aligning yourself carried over the forces of light and life being dropped to a small island in the Outer Hebrides. This is reminiscent of practices found she was found grievously when facing the rising dying sun, from the rough treatment she had received during her aerial journey. The symbolic importance she lived long enough to tell the story the Sluagh also appears in the time the islanders built a cairn over her grave. They were said to come a pile of stones meant to keep her body that period from just after sunset again when the last light faded. Such stories served multiple purposes. This was the most dangerous they explained mysterious appearances of strangers in unlikely places, safety to peril. They provided as the light died in the west, the dangers of the Sluagh emerged from that dying light to begin their hunt, and they reinforced there were also traditions about what to do if you heard the Sluagh approach, providing what seemed like physical. Some said you should immediately enter the nearest house and close all western-facing openings. Others said you should lie flat on the ground, making yourself as small and unnoticeable as possible, hoping the host would pass overhead without spotting you. Still others advised running as fast as you could toward the east, toward the rising sun's direction, seeking the symbolic protection of that life-giving orientation. The West's association with the Sluagh even extended to the weather. Storms coming from the west were particularly feared, as it was difficult to tell whether it was merely wind and rain approaching or whether the Sluagh were riding within the storm. The sound of western winds, especially at night, could send people hurrying to check their windows and doors, to reinforce their protections, to say prayers or charms that might keep the host at bay. Some accounts speak of people being able to tell when the Sluagh were approaching by a characteristic sound carried on the western wind. It was described variously as the beating of vast wings, the sound of a distant army on the march, the whisper of countless voices all speaking at once, or sometimes just an inexplicable sense of dread that came from the western direction. Those who heard such sounds knew to immediately seek shelter and seal their homes against what was coming. The fixation on the western direction also created certain vulnerabilities that people had to be aware of. A house that faced predominantly west, or that had large western-facing rooms or windows, was considered particularly at risk. Families living in such houses had to be especially vigilant about their protections. Some sources speak of houses being blessed or sanctified specifically to protect against dangers from the west, with priests or wise women performing rituals focused on the western walls and openings. In coastal communities, where many houses naturally faced west toward the sea, the problem was even more acute. The Atlantic Ocean, stretching away to the western horizon, was beautiful but also ominous, for somewhere out there lay the realms from which the Sluagh came. Fishermen and sailors had their own particular concerns about the Sluagh, as they spent much of their time on the western waters, potentially in closer proximity to the host's origin point than those who stayed on land. The western direction's significance in the Sluagh legend reflects a fundamental human tendency to map our spiritual and psychological concerns onto physical space. By giving evil a direction, by making it come from a specific place, our ancestors made it something that could be defended against through physical means. You couldn't fight the abstract concept of death or damnation, but you could close a western window. You couldn't prevent mortality, but you could orient your house and your travels in ways that minimized certain risks. This geographical dimension of the Sluagh legend also served to reinforce community bonds. The shared knowledge of which direction was dangerous, which times were perilous, created a common framework of understanding and mutual protection. Neighbors would remind each other about keeping western windows closed. Travelers would warn each other about western roads at night. The directional nature of the threat made it something that could be communicated clearly and defended against collectively. It's worth noting that while the west was the primary direction associated with the Sluagh, some accounts mentioned that they could approach from any direction except the east. This suggests that while the west was their preferred or most natural direction, their threat wasn't absolutely limited to it. This kept people from becoming complacent simply because a particular window or door didn't face directly west. The Sluagh were too dangerous, too cunning, to be defeated by a single simple precaution. Samhain, the night when the veil grows thin. If the west was the Sluagh's direction, then Samhain was their time. This ancient Celtic festival, pronounced Samhain, has evolved into our modern Halloween, but its original significance was far deeper and far darker than candy and costumes. Understanding Samhain is essential to understanding the Sluagh, for it was during this liminal festival that the host rode forth in their greatest power and number. Samhain marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of the dark half of the Celtic year. Celebrated at the midpoint between the autumnal equinox and the winter solstice, it usually fell around the end of October or the beginning of November. In the Celtic calendar, day began and ended at sunset, So Samhain's festivities would begin on the evening of October 31st and continue through November 1st. But Samhain was more than just a marker in the agricultural calendar. It was a liminal time, a threshold, a moment when the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin and permeable. All the rules that normally kept the living and the dead separate relaxed during Samhain. The gates to the otherworld stood open. Spirits could cross over into the mortal realm, and mortals could, if they were very brave or very foolish, peer into the realms beyond. This thinning of the veil made Samhain the most dangerous night of the year, particularly where the Sluagh were concerned. These spirits, who spent the rest of the year struggling against the barriers that kept them from freely preying on the living, found those barriers weakened during Samhain. They could move more freely, strike more easily, claim more victims than at any other time. The traditions and customs that surrounded Samhain reflect the deep fear that the Sluagh inspired. On this night more than any other, all western-facing windows and doors were kept firmly shut. But that was just the beginning of the precautions taken. In some communities, particularly in earlier times, fires were forbidden or drastically limited during Samhain. The reasoning behind this practice appears to have been that fire would attract the attention of the Sluagh, drawing them like moths to flame, bringing their malevolent presence to wherever the fire burned. Though scholars debate whether this was a universal practice or limited to specific regions, the tradition speaks to the complex relationship between protective fire and potentially dangerous visibility. This prohibition on fires created interesting traditions. In some communities, all hearth fires would be deliberately extinguished at Samhain, plunging homes into darkness and cold. Only after the most dangerous period of the night had passed would fires be relit, often from a communal bonfire that had been carefully tended by community leaders or religious figures. This relighting of the hearth fire from a sacred source was both a practical matter and a ritual of renewal, marking the survival of the community through the dangerous threshold into the dark half of the year. The bonfires themselves, when they were lit, served multiple purposes. They provided the sacred flame from which home fires could be relit. They created a gathering place for the community during this frightening time, allowing people to face the darkness together rather than alone. And they served as a form of purification and protection. People and animals would walk between two bonfires, or pass close to a single bonfire, allowing the smoke and heat to cleanse them of any malevolent influences. But these protective fires had to be carefully managed. They couldn't be too large or too bright, lest they draw the wrong kind of attention from the sky. There's a delicate balance evident in the folklore, a recognition that fire was both protection and risk, that the same light that might ward off evil could also mark you as a target for it. To venture out during Samhain night, particularly alone, was considered extremely dangerous. The Sluagh were not the only supernatural threat abroad during this time, though they were certainly among the most feared. All manner of spirits and fairy folk were free to roam, and the living were vulnerable to their attentions. Those who absolutely had to travel during Samhain took elaborate precautions. They might wear their clothes inside out, a strange tradition that somehow confused or repelled fairy folk. They might carry iron in their pockets, or rowan branches, or other protective charms. They would avoid lonely places, crossroads, bridges, and other liminal spaces where the otherworldly presence was strongest. One particularly evocative tradition from the Scottish Islands involved deliberately breaking the bier on which a corpse had been carried. The bier, being associated with death and having literally carried the dead, was considered something that the Sluagh might use for their own purposes, perhaps to carry away the living or to transport souls they had captured. By breaking it, the community removed this potential tool from the Sluagh's arsenal. This tradition reveals the practical, almost tactical, thinking that went into protective measures against the host. Disguising oneself was another Samhain tradition that had its roots in fear of the Sluagh and other spirits. People, particularly young men and children, would dress in costumes or masks, or blacken their faces with soot. This wasn't yet the playful trick-or-treating of modern Halloween, but a deadly serious attempt to avoid being recognized and targeted by the spirits abroad on this night. If the Sluagh couldn't identify you as human, if you looked strange and otherworldly yourself, perhaps they would pass you by. This tradition of disguise evolved over time, particularly in Scotland, into the practice of guising or gallishing, from which our modern trick-or-treating derives. Children would go door to door in disguise, performing tricks or reciting songs in exchange for treats. Originally, this served multiple purposes. The performance might appease any spirits watching, demonstrating skill and therefore worthiness to be left alone. The treats collected were both sustenance and magical protection, food being powerful in Celtic tradition as a ward against hungry spirits. And the very act of moving in groups, in disguise, in community, was safer than being alone and recognizable. The Dumb Supper was another Samhain tradition that reveals the complex relationship between the living and the dead during this time. A place would be set at the head of the table for ancestors or other departed family members. The meal would be served in absolute silence, and no one would look directly at the empty chair or the food placed there. The dead were being invited to return, but in a controlled, ritualized way. They were being honored and remembered, but not encouraged to linger or to cause trouble. The silence was essential. Speaking might break the ritual's protective framework, might allow the wrong spirits to hear and respond. Divination and fortune-telling were also common during Samhain, taking advantage of the thinned veil to glimpse the future or communicate with spirits. But such practices were not without risk. Opening yourself to otherworldly influence, even for beneficent purposes, could attract unwanted attention. The person performing divination had to be experienced and careful, knowing how to open doors without losing control of what might come through them. The association between Samhain and the Sluagh grew even stronger after Christianity arrived in Celtic lands. The Church attempted to Christianize the pagan festival, establishing All Saints' Day on November 1st and All Souls' Day on November 2nd. The night before All Saints' Day became All Hallows' Eve, eventually shortened to Halloween. But the pagan associations never fully disappeared. The idea that the dead walked on this night persisted, and the Sluagh fit perfectly into this Christianized framework as damned souls prowling for victims, as the Unforgiven Dead barred from the heaven that All Saints' Day celebrated. The merger of pagan and Christian beliefs actually intensified fear of the Sluagh in some ways. Now they were not just fairy folk or ancestral spirits but explicitly damned souls, sinners barred from redemption, dangerous both spiritually and physically. The Christian emphasis on the importance of last rites made the Sluagh even more threatening, for they sought specifically to steal souls before those rites could be administered, condemning their victims not just to death but to damnation. Samhain traditions were remarkably persistent in Celtic lands, continuing well into the modern era in many communities. Even as late as the early 20th century, folklorists and anthropologists could observe people in rural Ireland and Scotland following the old customs, closing their western windows on Samhain night, limiting their fires, staying indoors, treating the festival with a seriousness that might seem excessive to outsiders but that made perfect sense within their worldview. The agricultural significance of Samhain, marking as it did the end of the harvest and the final preparation for winter, meant that it was naturally a time of anxiety even without supernatural concerns. Would the stored food last through the winter? Would the weather be harsh? Would illness or accident claim family members during the dark months ahead? The Sluagh, in some ways, embodied all these natural fears, gave them form and specificity. The host became a symbol for everything that threatened survival during the dark half of the year. Today, as we celebrate Halloween with its costumes and candy, most people have forgotten the deeper significance of the date, have lost the knowledge of why this particular night was considered so dangerous. But for those who remember, For those who study the old folklore, Samhain remains a reminder of how our ancestors navigated a world they perceived as full of both seen and unseen dangers, how they used ritual and tradition to create islands of safety in a threatening universe. Voices from the past, historical accounts and evidence. The Sluagh would be merely an interesting footnote in Celtic mythology, if not for the remarkably detailed and persistent accounts that have been collected over the centuries. These aren't vague, amorphous legends, but specific testimonies from named individuals describing encounters they believed to be real. Examining these historical accounts gives us insight not just into the legend itself, but into how it functioned in actual communities and influenced real lives. One of our most valuable sources is Walter Yealing Evans-Wentz, an American anthropologist and Celtic scholar who traveled extensively through Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany between 1908 and 1910. His resulting work, The Fairer Faith in Celtic Countries, published in 1911 by Oxford University Press, represents one of the most comprehensive collections of fairy lore ever assembled, and the Sluagh feature prominently in his findings. What makes Evans-Wentz's work particularly valuable is his methodology. He didn't simply collect written sources or rely on secondary accounts. Instead, he went into communities and interviewed people directly, recording their testimonies in their own words. Many of his informants were elderly, the last generation to have grown up when belief in the Sluagh and other fairy folk was a living tradition rather than historical curiosity. These were people who had been told about the Sluagh by parents and grandparents who truly believed, who had grown up in communities where protections against the host were part of normal life. One of the most disturbing accounts collected by Evans-Wentz came from Scotland, involving the death of a child. According to the testimony, the boy was taken by the Sluagh during the night. His body was found the next morning at the back of the house, showing signs of having fallen from a great height. The informant believed firmly that the Sluagh had stolen the child's soul and then discarded his body, dropping it from the sky once they had what they wanted. The matter-of-fact way this horror was related, as something that simply happened, as a known and accepted if tragic part of life, reveals how deeply embedded belief in the Sluagh was in these communities. From the Isle of Barra, Evans-Wentz collected accounts of aerial battles between the Sluagh. Multiple informants spoke of seeing vast conflicts in the sky, hosts of spirits clashing in the darkness above the island. The evidence of these battles, they claimed, could be seen in the crimson staining on certain rocks and stones. They called it Fuel nan Sluagh, the blood of the hosts. In Gaelic tradition, they explained that this blood was visible as a beautiful red coloration on the rocks, particularly notable when melted by frost. Modern observers might note that this red coloration on rocks has perfectly natural geological explanations, likely involving iron compounds and oxidation. But to the inhabitants of Barra, who had no access to such knowledge, the stains were proof positive of the supernatural battles that folklore spoke of. This is a common pattern in the Sluagh legend, natural phenomena being interpreted through the lens of existing belief, creating what seemed like physical evidence for the stories. Alexander Carmichael, a Scottish folklorist and antiquarian who collected oral traditions throughout the Scottish Highlands and Islands during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, gathered many accounts that appear in his monumental work Carmina Gadelica. One of his informants spoke of the Sluagh flying in great clouds, up and down the face of the world like the starlings, and come back to the scenes of their earthly transgressions. This vivid description captures both the movement pattern attributed to the Sluagh and the belief that they were bound to the places where they had sinned during life. Another account from Carmichael's collection described men being abducted by the Sluagh and forced to serve as their archers. Marion MacLean, from the island of South Uist, told him about specific men from her community who had been taken and made to shoot at other humans or at cattle. She spoke of how some of these men, being good-hearted, tried to deliberately miss their targets, resisting the Sluagh's commands even at the risk of punishment. This detail, that moral character persisted even under supernatural compulsion, adds a poignant human dimension to the horror of abduction by the host. From Benbecula, Carmichael recorded the story of a woman, said to be a French princess, who was abducted by the Sluagh and carried vast distances through the air. She was transported over lands and seas, continents and islands, experiencing unimaginable hardships as she was dragged through space by the host. Eventually, she was dropped on the tiny island of Heistamal, behind Crigori, where she was found in such an injured state that she died shortly after. Before her death, however, she was able to tell her rescuers about the lands she had seen and the terrible journey she had endured. This account, with its specific geographical details and its tragic conclusion, functioned as both warning and proof, a cautionary tale with what seemed like physical evidence in the form of the woman's grave. Scottish writer and folklorist Robert Kirk, minister of Aberfoyle, provided one of the earliest written accounts of the Sluagh. Kirk wrote The Secret Commonwealth between 1691 and 1692, though it wouldn't be published until 1815. His work distinguished between different types of supernatural hosts, noting that the Highlands made a distinction betwixt Sluagh Seo Galta, earthly host, and Sluagh Sith. This distinction suggests that even in the late 17th century, there was scholarly interest in documenting and categorizing these beliefs, with communities recognizing different categories within the broader concept of the host. An account attributed to a monk, preserved in later folklore collections, provided a particularly vivid description. The spirits fly about in great clouds, up and down the face of the world like the starlings, and come back to the scenes of their earthly transgressions. No soul of them is without the clouds of earth, dimming the brightness of the works of earth. In bad nights, the Sluagh shelter themselves behind little russet docken stems and little yellow ragwort stalks. They fight battles in the air as men do on the earth. This description is notable for its detail about where the Sluagh sheltered during the day, suggesting the legends were treated as descriptions of entities with observable habits. Francis Tolmie, a native of Skye whom Evans-Wentz interviewed, provided insight into how the legends were already fading even in the early 20th century. She lamented that with the loss of Gaelic language came the loss of folk ideals and the instinctive religious feeling that had kept the fairy traditions alive. She distinguished carefully between different types of fairy folk, noting that the Sluagh, the aerial host, were specifically distinct from the fairies who dwelt under the hills. This distinction was important to believers, even if it might seem like splitting hairs to skeptical observers. The persistence of these beliefs into relatively modern times is striking. Even as late as the mid-20th century, folklorists could find individuals, usually elderly residents of rural areas, who had been raised with genuine belief in the Sluagh and who continued to follow the old protective customs. Windows on the western side of houses were kept closed during wakes or when someone was ill. Travelers avoided certain routes at night. Parents taught children about the dangers, even if they themselves weren't entirely sure whether to believe. What's particularly interesting about these historical accounts is their specificity. These aren't vague myths about generic evil spirits. People gave specific locations where encounters occurred, specific times of year, specific individuals who were taken or who witnessed the Sluagh. The detail suggests that something was happening, that people were experiencing phenomena they interpreted as encounters with the host. Whether those experiences were misidentified natural phenomena, mass hysteria, psychological experiences, or something else entirely, they were real enough to the experiencers to shape their behavior and beliefs. The accounts also reveal the social function of the Sluagh legend. When someone disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances, the Sluagh provided an explanation. When someone returned from an unexplained absence confused and exhausted, the Sluagh had taken them. When livestock died suddenly, the Sluagh were responsible. The legend served as a framework for making sense of events that otherwise defied understanding within the available knowledge systems of the time. But beyond mere explanation, the accounts reveal the Sluagh as a force that bound communities together. The shared belief created shared knowledge and shared practices. Everyone knew to close western windows when someone was dying. Everyone knew not to travel alone at night during Samhain. Everyone knew the signs that the Sluagh were near. This collective knowledge created a form of social cohesion, a shared framework for navigating danger both real and imagined. The gradual fading of belief in the Sluagh, which informants like Francis Tolmie noted even in the early 20th century, occurred as Celtic communities became more integrated with the wider world, as education spread, as the old language and customs gave way to modern ways. But the legends persist in recorded form, testimony to a worldview in which the supernatural was real and immediate, where the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable and dangerous, where knowledge passed down through generations was quite literally a matter of life and death. Regional variations, different voices, same fear. While the core concept of the Sluagh remained remarkably consistent across Celtic lands, different regions developed their own particular takes on the legend, their own specific details and variations. Examining these regional differences reveals how folklore adapts to local circumstances while maintaining its essential character, and how different communities emphasize different aspects of the legend based on their particular fears and experiences. In Ireland, the Sluagh were most commonly understood as restless spirits of the unforgiven dead, souls condemned to wander for their sins or their incomplete business on earth. Irish accounts tend to emphasize the moral dimension of the Sluagh, the idea that they are the consequence of dying unrepentant or uncommitted to either good or evil. There's a strong Christian influence visible in Irish versions of the legend, with the Sluagh explicitly linked to concepts of damnation and the importance of last rites. Irish folklore also particularly emphasized the Sluagh's connection to specific places where the dead were especially restless. Battlefields where men had died violently, graveyards that were improperly maintained or where the dead had been buried without proper ceremony, crossroads where suicides or criminals had been interred. These were all places where the Sluagh were said to gather. The connection between the host and specific geographical locations with troubled histories gave the legend a very tangible, immediate quality. Scotland, by contrast, developed a more complex understanding of the Sluagh that incorporated them more fully into fairy lore. While Scottish accounts certainly included the idea of the unforgiven dead, they also frequently described the Sluagh as a type of fairy folk, specifically as the most malevolent members of the Unseelie Court. This interpretation emphasized their connection to the broader supernatural realm rather than focusing solely on their origin as departed human souls. Scottish accounts, particularly from the Highlands and Islands, also seemed to focus more on the physical danger of the Sluagh, their capacity to abduct people and carry them vast distances through the air. The aerial battles said to occur above the Isle of Barra, the accounts of people being snatched from the ground and transported over seas and mountains, these dramatic physical interactions feature more prominently in Scottish sources than in Irish ones. The Scottish islands each developed their own particular Sluagh traditions. On Barra, as we've discussed, the emphasis was on those aerial battles and the physical evidence left behind. On South Uist and Benbecula, accounts focused more on abductions and on the Sluagh's use of humans as forced servants. On Skye, the connection between the Sluagh and specific local geographical features was particularly strong, with certain glens and coastlines being known as particularly dangerous because the host frequented them. The Hebrides generally had what might be the most elaborate Sluagh traditions, perhaps because these islands, being remote and retaining Gaelic language and culture longer than mainland areas, preserved older beliefs more completely. The practice of breaking funeral biers to prevent the Sluagh from using them was particularly associated with the Hebrides. So was the tradition of leaving offerings of milk for the cat Sith on Samhain, a practice that existed alongside protections against the Sluagh, suggesting a complex negotiation with multiple supernatural entities. In the Highlands, the Sluagh were sometimes more closely associated with specific clans or families. Certain lineages were said to be particularly attractive to the Sluagh, perhaps because of ancient curses or because of particularly grievous sins committed by ancestors. This created a hereditary dimension to the danger, where knowing one's family history became part of understanding one's vulnerability to supernatural threats. The Isle of Man, while sharing many traditions with Ireland and Scotland, had its own unique takes on the Sluagh. Manx folklore tended to use different names for similar entities, and while the concept of the Unforgiven Dead flying through the night certainly existed there, it was often discussed under different terminology and sometimes merged with other types of fairy folk. The Manx also had strong traditions about buggans and other specific supernatural beings that sometimes overlapped with or replaced Sluagh-like figures. Welsh and Breton traditions had their own equivalents to the Sluagh, though often under different names. The Corn Andun, the Hounds of Andun, served a similar function in Welsh folklore as harbingers of death and participants in supernatural hunts. While not identical to the Sluagh, they occupied a similar conceptual space and were subject to similar fears and protections. Breton folklore had the Ankou, a personification of death who collected souls, and various traditions about the dead returning to haunt the living, though again with different specific details than the Sluagh legend. The degree of fear associated with the Sluagh also varied regionally. In some areas, they were the most feared of all supernatural entities, worse than any demon or evil fairy. In other regions, they were just one danger among many, serious but not necessarily paramount. This variation likely reflected local experiences, local tragedies, and the particular emphases of those who passed the traditions down through generations. Urban areas and lowland regions, where Celtic traditions mixed more with other cultural influences, and where modernization came earlier, tended to have weaker or more fragmented Sluagh traditions. The legend thrived best in rural, Gaelic-speaking communities where traditional ways of life persisted longest. As these communities diminished, as Gaelic gave way to English, as electricity brought light to dark places and roads connected isolated villages, belief in the Sluagh faded more quickly. But even within regions where belief remained strong, there was variation in how the Sluagh were understood and what protections were considered effective. Some families swore by iron, others by rowan, still others by specific prayers or charms passed down through their particular lineage. The flexibility of folklore allowed for this variation while maintaining the core story, ensuring that the legend could adapt to different circumstances and different needs. The variation also extended to when the Sluagh were most dangerous. While Samhain was universally acknowledged as the most perilous time, some regions had additional dangerous periods. In some areas, all of the quarterly festivals, the fire festivals of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnaza, were considered times when the Sluagh's power increased. In others, the entire period from November to April, the dark half of the year, was considered dangerous, with Samhain merely being the peak. Protection and defenses, keeping the host at bay. Understanding the Sluagh was only half the battle. The other half was knowing how to protect yourself, your loved ones, and your property from their predations. Celtic communities developed a sophisticated array of protective measures against the host, ranging from architectural choices to specific rituals, from magical charms to simple common-sense precautions. These protections reveal much about how our ancestors thought magic and the supernatural worked, and how they navigated a world they perceived as full of invisible dangers. The most fundamental and most widely practiced protection was the one we've already discussed extensively: keeping western-facing windows and doors closed, particularly when someone in the house was ill or dying. This wasn't a casual suggestion, but a strict rule that could mean the difference between a soul finding rest and being dragged off to join the Sluagh. The practice was so ingrained that even people who had begun to doubt the old beliefs often continued to follow it, reasoning that it cost nothing to maintain the tradition and might prevent something terrible. But closing windows was just the beginning. Iron, that most magical of metals in Celtic tradition, was considered a powerful protection against all manner of supernatural entities, and the Sluagh were no exception. Iron had several uses in protecting against the host. A simple iron nail kept in one's pocket was said to pin you to the earth, making it impossible for the Sluagh to lift you into the air and carry you away. Iron shears placed near a child's bed would prevent the Sluagh from stealing the child during the night. A horseshoe, itself made of iron and shaped like a crescent moon, hung above a doorway with the opening facing upward, to catch and hold good fortune, would bar entry to malevolent spirits. An iron knife placed at the threshold of an open fairy mound would prevent the entrance from closing, protecting anyone foolish enough to venture inside from being trapped. While this specific use relates more to fairy mounds than directly to the Sluagh, it illustrates the general principle that iron could disrupt and obstruct supernatural entities. An axe placed under one's pillow was said to protect the sleeper, and striking at the Sluagh with iron was said to cause them to disappear immediately. The reasons for iron's protective properties in Celtic tradition are ancient and somewhat mysterious. One interpretation is that iron, being one of the great technological advances of the Iron Age Celts, allowed them to create superior weapons and tools, and perhaps its practical power translated into spiritual power in their cosmology. Another possibility is that the connection runs even deeper, to some forgotten understanding of iron's essential nature that our ancestors intuited but that we've lost. What we can say with certainty is that across Celtic lands, iron was consistently regarded as a powerful ward against supernatural threats. Rowan wood, also known as mountain ash, was another powerful protective substance. Rowan trees themselves were considered sacred and protective, and the wood had multiple uses. A length of rowan branch could be used as a walking stick that would protect the traveler from supernatural attack. Rowan planted near a house would guard the dwelling and its inhabitants. The wood could be fashioned into protective charms or crosses that would ward off evil. In some traditions, rowan was considered even more effective than iron, particularly against fairy folk, though both were often used together for maximum protection. Rowan's red berries were significant, as red was a color generally avoided by fairy folk. Many protective traditions involved red objects or substances. Red thread, red ribbons, or red berries could all serve as wards against supernatural danger. This aversion to red might stem from ancient associations with blood, with life force, with something fundamentally human and therefore antithetical to the otherworldly entities. Salt was another substance with strong protective properties. It could be sprinkled across thresholds and windowsills to create barriers that the Sluagh could not cross. Some traditions held that fairies and spirits were compelled to count every grain of salt they encountered, and if there were enough grains, they might be kept occupied until dawn, at which point their power would wane and they would have to retreat. Whether or not the salt needed to be blessed by a priest was a matter of some debate, with different families in different regions having different beliefs about this. Religious protections were also extremely important, particularly after Christianity became dominant in Celtic lands. Prayer was considered a powerful defense, with specific prayers being particularly effective. The Lord's Prayer, prayers to Saint Michael, who was strongly associated with protection against evil, and prayers to one's guardian angel were all commonly used. The sound of church bells was said to drive away evil spirits, and hymns sung aloud could create a protective atmosphere. Making the sign of the cross was a quick protection that could be deployed in an emergency. If you heard or sensed the Sluagh approaching, crossing yourself immediately might cause them to veer away. Holy water, blessed by a priest, could be sprinkled around one's home or person for protection. Crucifixes, rosaries, and other religious objects were powerful talismans against supernatural evil. But many protective traditions predated Christianity and continued alongside it, sometimes being reinterpreted in Christian terms. Turning one's coat inside out was said to confuse fairy folk and spirits, making you unrecognizable to them. This practice had no obvious Christian connection, and likely stemmed from pre-Christian magical thinking about identity and appearance. The logic seems to be that the Sluagh recognized people by their clothing, and by turning it inside out, you created a disguise that would allow you to pass unnoticed. Fire, while it could attract the Sluagh's attention, could also serve as protection if used correctly. A torch carried while traveling at night could keep the darkness at bay both literally and figuratively. Walking around your property with a torch, particularly at Samhain, could sanctify and protect the space. The hearth fire, the heart of the home, was itself a kind of protection, though it needed to be properly tended and respected. Certain plants beyond Rowan also had protective properties. St. John's wort was powerful against supernatural threats and could be hung in windows or worn on the person. Four-leaf clovers were lucky and protective, granting the bearer the ability to see through fairy glamour and avoid being deceived by otherworldly beings. Hazelwood had magical properties, and hazel staffs could serve as protective walking sticks. Blackthorn, though associated with dark magic in some traditions, was also sometimes used for protection, its thorny nature making it a barrier against evil. Certain actions and behaviors were protective. Staying indoors after dark, particularly during dangerous times like Samhain, was the most basic precaution. If you had to travel, going in a group was safer than going alone. Making noise, such as ringing bells or clanging metal, could warn off or drive away threatening spirits. Singing, particularly hymns or traditional protective songs, created a kind of spiritual armor around the singer. Avoiding certain behaviors was equally important. Speaking the name of the Sluagh, particularly saying it 9 times, could call them to you, so the name was used sparingly and carefully. Traveling alone to liminal places like crossroads, bridges, or the boundaries between properties was asking for trouble. Being outside during Samhain without good reason and proper protections was foolhardy. Failing to close western windows when someone was dying was tempting fate. Some protections were proactive rather than defensive. Offerings left for the Sluagh or other spirits might appease them or distract them from more harmful activities. A saucer of milk left out on Samhain, ostensibly for the cat Sith but perhaps also acknowledged by other entities, was one such offering. Food left at crossroads or at the boundaries of properties served similar purposes, giving the spirits something to occupy them that didn't involve harassing the living. The most elaborate protections involved ritual specialists. A priest could bless a home, creating a sacred space that evil spirits would struggle to enter. A wise woman or cunning man, those folk magic practitioners found in most communities, could create specific charms or perform rituals tailored to an individual's or family's needs. These specialists knew the old ways, knew the words of power, knew how to negotiate with the supernatural realm in ways that ordinary people did not. Maintaining these protections required constant vigilance. It wasn't enough to close your western windows once. You had to remember to check them regularly, especially during dangerous times. Iron in your pocket didn't help if you forgot to carry it. Prayers were only effective if you said them. The protective traditions required active participation, required that people take their safety seriously and remain mindful of the invisible dangers around them. This constant vigilance, this need to always be thinking about protection, reveals something important about how our ancestors lived. Their world was not divided into the natural and the supernatural the way ours is. Everything was interwoven. The physical and the spiritual existed side by side, interpenetrated each other. A house needed a roof to keep out rain and walls to keep out wind, but it also needed iron and rowan to keep out the sluagh. One type of protection was no more or less real than the other. The effectiveness of these protections was, of course, a matter of belief and cannot be verified by modern standards. To those who genuinely believed in the sluagh, the protections worked because following the proper rituals and taking the right precautions was understood to keep the host at bay. Whether the protections had any objective efficacy beyond their psychological and social benefits is beside the point from a folkloric perspective. What matters is that they gave people a sense of agency over forces they perceived as threatening, a way of protecting themselves and their loved ones in what they experienced as a dangerous world. The protections transformed fear from a paralyzing force into something manageable, something that could be guarded against through knowledge and proper action. The sluagh in modern times, a persistent legend. One might expect that as modernity spread through Ireland and Scotland, bringing with it electricity, education, mass communication, and scientific thinking, belief in the sluagh would simply vanish like morning mist under the sun. Yet the reality has been far more complex and far more interesting. The sluagh persist in various forms, their legend continuing to evolve and adapt to new circumstances, influencing modern culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The belief itself has largely faded from literal acceptance in most communities. You won't find many people today who genuinely fear that the host of the Unforgiven Dead will fly in through their western windows to steal their souls. The protections that were once matters of life and death are now, at best, charming folk customs maintained more from tradition than from real fear. But the complete disappearance of belief would be overstating the case. Even today, in remote parts of Ireland and Scotland, particularly among older generations, you can find people who maintain at least a respectful agnosticism about the old beliefs. They might not actively believe in the sluagh, but they won't completely dismiss the possibility either. They might still keep western windows closed during wakes, not because they are certain the sluagh will come, but because it costs nothing to maintain the tradition, and one can never be completely sure. This respectful uncertainty represents a fascinating middle ground between traditional belief and modern skepticism. It's the idea that our ancestors weren't fools, that they observed their world carefully and developed their beliefs for good reasons, even if we can't fully accept those beliefs ourselves anymore. It's a recognition that the world remains mysterious in many ways, that scientific understanding hasn't answered every question, and that completely dismissing traditional knowledge might mean losing something valuable. The sluagh have found new life in literature, particularly in fantasy and horror genres. Authors drawing on Celtic mythology frequently incorporate the host into their works, sometimes staying close to traditional descriptions, other times reimagining them for new narratives. The sluagh appear in everything from children's books to young adult fantasy to adult horror novels, each adaptation bringing something new while maintaining echoes of the old legends. In popular culture, the sluagh have made appearances in various media. They've shown up in television series focused on supernatural themes, in video games that draw on Celtic mythology, in role-playing games that include Celtic-inspired supernatural threats. Each appearance introduces the sluagh to new audiences who might never have encountered them through traditional folklore, spreading awareness of the legend in new forms. The internet age has been particularly interesting for sluagh legends. Websites devoted to Celtic mythology, folklore forums, video creators focusing on mythological content, all have helped keep the sluagh in public consciousness. Social media allows for rapid sharing of stories and artwork inspired by the legend. The sluagh have been memed, illustrated, discussed, and analyzed by people all over the world, many of whom have no direct connection to Celtic culture, but who find the legend compelling. Some modern pagans and neo-druids have incorporated acknowledgement of the Sluagh into their spiritual practices, particularly around Samhain. While these modern practitioners generally don't literally believe in the Sluagh in the same way their ancestors might have, they often recognize the host as symbolic of death, darkness, and the thin boundaries between worlds. Samhain rituals might include acknowledgement of the Sluagh as part of honoring the full scope of Celtic spiritual traditions. The psychological and symbolic interpretations of the Sluagh have become increasingly common. Modern observers often see the legend as embodying universal human fears about death, about what happens after we die, about being forgotten or rejected, about suffering that continues beyond death. The Sluagh represent the terrifying possibility that death might not be the end of suffering, that there might be fates worse than death itself. Some scholars have explored how the Sluagh legend might have served important social functions beyond mere superstition. It provided explanations for phenomena that were otherwise inexplicable in a pre-scientific worldview. It created shared knowledge that bound communities together. It enforced certain behaviors that might have had practical benefits even if the supernatural reasoning behind them wasn't literally true. The closed western windows during wakes, for instance, might have helped prevent disease spread even if they didn't actually keep out the Sluagh. The legend has also been examined through psychological lenses, particularly regarding sleep paralysis, night terrors, and other experiences that might have been interpreted as Sluagh encounters. The sensation of being unable to move, of pressure on one's chest, of sensing a malevolent presence. These are common features of sleep paralysis that could easily be interpreted as the Sluagh attempting to steal one's soul. Similarly, the phenomenon of hearing inexplicable sounds in the night, seeing shadows that seem to move with purpose, these perceptual experiences could have fed into and reinforced belief in the host. This doesn't mean the Sluagh were only psychological phenomena, but rather that such experiences may have contributed to the vividness and persistence of the legend. Tourism in Ireland and Scotland sometimes incorporates the Sluagh legend, though often in toned-down, more palatable forms. Ghost tours might mention them. Museums dedicated to Celtic culture might have exhibits about fairy lore that include the host. Hotels in remote areas might tell stories about local Sluagh legends, adding atmospheric spice to a visitor's experience while usually downplaying the terror that once made these stories matters of life and death. The environmental and atmospheric factors that contributed to Sluagh sightings have been studied with modern tools. The way wind sounds as it passes over certain landscapes, the way mist and clouds can create visual effects that might be mistaken for flocks of birds or shadowy hosts, the acoustic properties of valleys and coastal areas that could amplify and distort sounds. All these natural phenomena that our ancestors interpreted as supernatural can now be understood scientifically. Yet this understanding doesn't completely dispel the eerie quality of experiencing these phenomena firsthand, particularly in the landscapes where the legends originated. The Sluagh legend has also contributed to ongoing discussions about cultural preservation. As Gaelic language and traditional Celtic cultures face continuing pressure and decline, the stories and legends that were once transmitted orally in Gaelic are at risk of being lost. Recording, translating, and preserving these legends, including the Sluagh stories, has become part of broader efforts to maintain Celtic cultural heritage. The host, in this sense, have become ambassadors of a culture, representatives of a worldview that differs fundamentally from modern rationalism. Interestingly, some modern responses to the legend focus on sympathy for the Sluagh themselves rather than fear. Contemporary retellings sometimes portray them as tragic figures, souls condemned to endless wandering through no fault of their own, victims of cosmic injustice rather than architects of their own damnation. This shift from fear to sympathy reflects modern sensibilities while still engaging with the core of the legend. The persistence of the Sluagh legend also says something about the power of good storytelling. At their heart, The best legends aren't just lists of attributes and behaviors. They tap into something deeper, something archetypal, something that speaks to fundamental human concerns and fears. The Sluagh, with their tragic origin, their terrifying appearance, their implacable hunting, their presence at the boundary between life and death, embody fears and anxieties that haven't disappeared just because we understand more about how the world works. We no longer believe that mysterious deaths are caused by soul-stealing spirits, but we still fear death and what comes after. We no longer interpret storms as supernatural hunts, but we still feel small and vulnerable when nature's power is unleashed. We no longer think that sorrow can literally call down curses upon us, but we still recognize the dangerous power of depression and grief. The Sluagh, in other words, may no longer be literally believed, but the truths they represented remain relevant. Reflections on the host, meaning in the darkness. As we come to the end of our journey into the legend of the Sluagh, it's worth reflecting on what these stories meant to those who believed them and what they might mean for us today. The host of the Unforgiven Dead represents far more than simple superstition or quaint folk belief. They embody fundamental human concerns about death, morality, redemption, and the possibility that our actions might have consequences that extend beyond the grave. To the Celtic peoples who developed and transmitted these legends, the Sluagh were real in a way that's difficult for modern minds to fully grasp. They weren't metaphors or symbols or psychological projections. They were entities that existed, that posed genuine threats, that had to be accounted for in daily life. The western windows stayed closed not because of symbolic meaning, but because opening them might genuinely allow soul-stealing spirits to enter. The precautions taken at Samhain weren't theatrical, but necessary survival measures. This absolute belief created a world that was, in many ways, more coherent than our modern worldview. Everything fit together. Natural and supernatural weren't separate categories, but different aspects of a single, integrated reality. Moral behavior mattered not just because of abstract ethical principles or fear of legal consequences, but because dying unrepentant might condemn you to join the Sluagh. The protections worked not because of placebo effect, but because iron, rowan, and prayer genuinely had power over supernatural entities. The loss of this worldview represents both freedom and loss. We're freed from the constant fear of supernatural threats, from the need to maintain elaborate protections, from the terror of what might be lurking beyond our windows. But we've also lost something profound, a sense of enchantment, a feeling that the world is deeper and more mysterious than what we can see and measure, a connection to traditions and ways of thinking that stretch back thousands of years. The Sluagh legend also reveals sophisticated thinking about death and the afterlife. The idea that some souls might be rejected by all possible afterlives, that there could be fates worse than either heaven or hell, suggests deep theological and philosophical thinking. The Sluagh represent a kind of spiritual homelessness, beings caught in an eternal limbo because they fit nowhere. This concept might have provided comfort to some, explaining why bad things happened while maintaining belief in a fundamentally just cosmos. If terrible spirits harried the living, it was because those spirits had earned their damnation, not because the universe was random and meaningless. Yet the tradition that innocents, particularly unbaptized children, might become part of the Sluagh introduces a more tragic element. Here we see the collision of different belief systems, the tension between older Celtic understanding of the afterlife and Christian theology. The resulting legend reflects real anxieties parents faced about infant mortality, about the fate of children who died before they could be properly initiated into the Christian faith. The Sluagh legend also functioned as social control, though perhaps not in a cynical or manipulative way. By embodying the consequences of sin and moral failure, the host reinforced community values and behavioral norms. The threat that you might become one of the Sluagh if you died unrepentant created powerful motivation to seek reconciliation, to receive last rites, to maintain right relationship with both the human community and the divine. This wasn't necessarily exploitation, but rather the way any culture uses stories to transmit and reinforce its values. The protective traditions surrounding the Sluagh created moments of community solidarity. When someone was dying, when Samhain approached, when danger threatened, people came together to maintain the protections, to share knowledge, to support each other through dangerous times. The shared belief in the Sluagh paradoxically created connections between the living even as it reminded them of the isolation of being human, of facing mortality alone. For us, living in our thoroughly disenchanted modern world, what can the Sluagh legend offer? Perhaps it serves as a reminder that our ancestors were neither fools nor simple. They observed their world carefully, developed sophisticated explanations for what they observed, and created rich traditions that helped them navigate existence. We might not believe in the literal reality of the Sluagh, but we can appreciate the psychological, social, and spiritual truths the legend contained. The Sluagh remind us that death remains mysterious despite all our medical and scientific advances. We know more about the biological processes of dying than any previous generation, but we know no more about what, if anything, comes after. In that fundamental uncertainty, we're no different from our ancestors who feared the host. The legend also reminds us of the importance of community and tradition in facing the inexplicable aspects of existence. Our ancestors didn't face the darkness alone. They had shared stories, shared protections, shared understanding of the dangers and how to guard against them. We, with our individualistic modern worldview, might learn something from their collective approach to mystery and fear. Finally, the Sluagh serve as testament to the power of storytelling itself. These legends have survived centuries, adapted to changing circumstances, influenced countless lives, and shaped entire cultures. They've been retold in countless ways, yet something essential persists through all the variations. That persistence suggests they touch something important, something true in a deeper sense than mere factual accuracy. The host of the Unforgiven Dead still ride, if only in memory and story. They still hunt, if only through the power of narrative to move and frighten us. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps keeping these stories alive, remembering the beliefs of our ancestors, acknowledging the depth and complexity of their worldview, is itself a kind of protection against a different sort of darkness. The flat, empty darkness of a world that has lost its capacity for enchantment. Until we meet again. And so, my dear listeners, we've reached the end of our journey into the dark skies where the Sluagh fly. We've explored their name and nature, their appearances and behaviors, their place in the broader context of Celtic mythology. We've heard the testimonies of those who believed they had encountered the host, and we've examined how protection against them shaped daily life in Celtic communities. We've seen how the legend has persisted and evolved into modern times, transforming but never quite disappearing. The Sluagh remind us that our world, rational and well-lit though it may seem, still contains mysteries, still has room for wonder and terror, still benefits from remembering the wisdom of those who came before us. Whether you believe in the literal reality of the host or see them as powerful symbols and compelling stories, they deserve our attention and our respect. As you go about your days, perhaps you'll find yourself noticing western windows differently, or thinking twice about being abroad on dark autumn nights. Perhaps you'll remember these stories when the wind howls from the west, or when flocks of black birds wheel overhead against the grey sky. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll understand a little better how our ancestors saw the world, how they made sense of death and darkness, how they found ways to live with fear while not being paralyzed by it. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into one of the darkest corners of Celtic folklore. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Sluagh, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell, So many more corners of Irish and Celtic mythology to explore together. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you heard local legends about the Sluagh? Do you have family traditions that might connect to protecting against them? I'd love to hear your stories and experiences. Until next time, keep your western windows closed after dark. Keep your iron close and your rowan closer. And remember that the old stories still have power. Sweet dreams, dear wanderers, and may your sleep be peaceful and untroubled by the flights of the restless dead. Thank you for being here. Until we meet again.